Diego Morales, Samuel Khamalo, Alejandro Vargas, Dinat Srisai, Victor Dragunov, 5 men from different corners of the world, each born in violence, each rising to power through blood and fear. Their names alone are enough to silence streets, empty neighborhoods, and terrify nations. Together, they lead the most dangerous gangs on the planet. El Sangre Roja, the Black Vultures, the Silent Cartel, the Serpents of the East, and the Crimson Brotherhood. These are not just gangs. They are empires of terror, built on loyalty, corruption, and death. This is the story of how they rose from shadows to control entire regions and how their influence threatens the world itself. Caracas was a city of noise, chaos, and endless survival, but within that noise, one name rose like a storm: El Sangre Roja. The gang didn't start as a massive empire. It began with a young street fighter named Diego Morales, who was abandoned by his family at a young age and grew up on the violent backstreets. He learned quickly that the only way to live was to fight harder, hit faster, and never show fear. What separated Diego from the others wasn't just his strength, but his willingness to go further than anyone else. He didn't just beat his opponents, he made examples of them. Word spread about the boy who left his enemies broken on the pavement, and before long, desperate youths and hardened criminals alike began following him. That was the seed that grew into El Sangre Roja, a gang that would soon stain the streets of Caracas with blood. Diego's leadership wasn't built on charisma alone. He created rules, rituals, and a system that turned ordinary men into loyal soldiers. The most infamous ritual was the initiation. To join El Sangre Roja, recruits had to shed blood. Sometimes it was a rival, sometimes an innocent, but the rule was clear: without blood there was no loyalty. The moment a recruit crossed that line, there was no turning back. This cruel test cemented the gang's reputation as merciless and unbreakable. Fear became their weapon, and loyalty was written in blood. Soon, every red handprint painted on a wall became a warning. Diego Morales and his men were watching. The gang began with street-level crimes: pickpocketing, extortion, protection rackets, but Diego had bigger ambition. He studied how larger cartels worked, how they moved drugs, how they laundered money, and how they bought silence from officials. Slowly, El Sangre Roja moved into smuggling operations, trafficking not just drugs but also weapons. Their brutality gave them dominance, but their strategy gave them reach. Within a few years, Diego was no longer just the king of his neighborhood. He was commanding networks that stretched across Venezuela and touched the borders of Colombia and Brazil. Authorities knew about El Sangre Roja, but knowing and acting were two different things. Many police officers were already on Diego's payroll, and those who weren't quickly learned the price of resistance. Families of honest officers were threatened, and entire precincts were compromised. It wasn't uncommon for investigations to vanish, evidence to disappear, and witnesses to suddenly retract their statements. Every failed attempt to stop them made the public lose more faith in law enforcement. For the people of Caracas, it wasn't the government that ruled their streets, it was El Sangre Roja. The brutality of the gang's methods shocked outsiders. Businesses that refused to pay protection money were burned to the ground. Rivals were executed in public squares, their bodies left with crimson marks as a warning. Entire neighborhoods learned that silence was survival. Nobody dared to speak the name of Diego Morales in the open. Mothers warned their children never to look twice at the black SUVs that rolled through the streets. People who once believed in community now lived in constant fear, locked inside their homes after dark, listening to distant gunfire that reminded them who was in control. What truly set El Sangre Roja apart, however, was Diego's vision. He didn't want his gang to remain a local terror, he wanted it to become a regional power. To achieve this, he built alliances with smugglers, bribed border guards, and established secret trade routes across South America. Drugs moved north, weapons moved south, and money flowed endlessly into the gang's pockets. With that money, Diego bought more loyalty, more firepower, and more influence. The handprint of El Sangre Roja was no longer just on the walls of Caracas. It began appearing in other cities, spreading like a plague. By the time the government realized the true scale of the threat, it was too late. El Sangre Roja was no longer just a gang, it was an institution, one that had woven itself into the economy, politics, and daily life of the people. Diego Morales had risen from a forgotten boy on the streets to one of the most feared men in the world. His empire wasn't built on trust or respect but on terror, so deep that even speaking against him was considered an act of suicide. The story of El Sangre Roja was no longer about a gang terrorizing a neighborhood. It was about the birth of a criminal power that no one could easily stop. Johannesburg was no stranger to crime, but the rise of the Black Vultures changed the meaning of fear in the city. They were not a street gang in the traditional sense. They were a paramilitary force disguised as criminals. The man behind their creation, Samuel Khumalo, had once been a soldier. His years in combat had hardened him into someone who believed in discipline, strategy, and control. When he left the army, he carried with him not only military skills but also deep resentment toward a system that had abandoned him. That anger became the fire that fueled his transformation from soldier to warlord. With a small group of loyal ex-soldiers, Samuel laid the foundation of the Black Vultures, a gang that would grow into one of the most feared criminal organizations in Africa. Unlike other gangs that relied on chaos, the Black Vultures thrived on order. Samuel trained his men as if they were an army, drilling them in tactics, formations, and weapon handling. Their operations were executed with military precision. When they raided a target, there was no shouting, no confusion, no wasted movements. Every man knew his role, and every raid ended in success. Victims were often taken before they even realized what was happening. Businesses, politicians, and wealthy families soon understood that no amount of guards or gates could protect them from the Black Vultures. Their specialty was kidnapping and extortion. Samuel recognized that controlling people through fear was effective, but controlling them through their families was even more powerful. Victims were abducted in the dead of night, transported to hidden camps, and held until ransoms were paid. The money flowed in quickly because those who hesitated to pay were dealt with in the most brutal ways. Bodies were returned marked with vulture feathers, a grim symbol that told the entire city who was responsible. These public warnings kept fear alive and ensured that resistance was rare. It didn't take long for the Black Vultures to expand their reach. What began as a Johannesburg operation soon spread to other South African cities. From there, Samuel built networks that connected to international human trafficking routes. The gang became notorious for moving people across borders, sometimes for forced labor, other times for darker purposes. With every deal, the Black Vultures grew richer and more untouchable. Their discipline and secrecy made them difficult to track. Authorities would find themselves chasing shadows, arriving at locations only to discover the gang had moved days earlier. Samuel Khumalo's personal presence was part of the fear. Unlike many leaders who hid behind lieutenants, he often appeared at operations himself, dressed in black with a vulture insignia on his chest. Witnesses who lived long enough to speak described him as cold, calculating, and utterly fearless. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried the weight of command. His men treated him less like a leader and more like a general. To them, joining the Black Vultures wasn't just a choice, it was a transformation. They were no longer criminals, they were soldiers in a private war for power and dominance. The effect on Johannesburg was devastating. Businesses closed, fearing extortion. Families fled the city, abandoning homes to escape Samuel's reach. The atmosphere of fear was so strong that people avoided speaking about the gang as if mentioning their name might summon them. Even politicians and police officials avoided direct confrontation. Many were already compromised, accepting bribes to look the other way. Others were too afraid to act, knowing what happened to those who challenged the Black Vultures. The gang had turned the city into their hunting ground, and everyone else lived as prey. As international agencies began investigating, they discovered that the Black Vultures weren't merely surviving on violence, they were thriving as a business. Their profits from kidnappings and trafficking were reinvested into weapons, vehicles, and safe houses. Each year they became more advanced, blending old-school brutality with modern tactics. What made them uniquely terrifying was their ability to vanish. They would strike with deadly force, collect their ransom, and disappear into the night without leaving a trace. The vulture feathers left behind weren't just symbols, they were reminders that the predators always returned. By the time the world recognized the full scale of the threat, the Black Vultures had become more than a gang.
They were an organization with international influence, led by a man whose mind was sharpened by war and whose heart was hardened by vengeance. Samuel Khumalo had taken his skills as a soldier and twisted them into something dark. The black vultures didn't just feed on fear, they thrived on it, circling above Johannesburg like shadows, ready to swoop down on anyone who dared to resist. In the northern territories of Mexico, whispers carried a name that few dared to repeat aloud: the silent cartel. Unlike other gangs that thrived on loud gun battles, explosions and public executions, this group built its empire through an unnerving absence of noise. Their leader, Alejandro Vargas, was unlike the typical cartel boss. He was not a man of showmanship or public displays of power. Instead, he relied on subtlety, patience, and psychological warfare. Alejandro understood that the greatest weapon was not a bullet, but fear itself, and silence could be more terrifying than chaos. Under his rule, entire communities were brought under control without a single shot fired in the streets. The silent cartel operated with a chilling method. When their black SUVs rolled into a town, streets emptied instantly. People locked themselves indoors, children were pulled from playgrounds, and shutters slammed shut. No one dared to be seen. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. When Alejandro wanted to make an example of someone, the individual simply vanished. No blood, no crime scene, no witnesses. Families woke up to find their loved ones gone, with no explanation and no trace. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. This ability to erase people without spectacle made the silent cartel untouchable in the eyes of the public. Fear lived in every unspoken word, in every cautious glance, and in every locked door after nightfall. The cartel's operations extended far beyond kidnappings. Alejandro used his influence to infiltrate local businesses, smuggling routes, and political systems. Those who resisted disappeared, and those who complied lived under constant threat. He controlled ports, border crossings, and highways, moving narcotics and weapons with terrifying efficiency. The key to their success was invisibility. Unlike other cartels that flaunted wealth and violence, the silent cartel kept everything low profile. The less attention they attracted, the more secure their empire became. This approach made it difficult for law enforcement to gather evidence or even prove the cartel's existence. Beyond rumors and whispers, what terrified people most was Alejandro's philosophy. He believed silence was stronger than violence because it created paranoia. In towns under the cartel's grip, nobody trusted their neighbors. People wondered who was an informant, who was secretly working for Alejandro, and who might be next to vanish. Communities broke apart from within, divided by families refused to speak even in private, because rumors spread that the cartel bugged phones, watched homes, and paid locals to report conversations. Whether those rumors were true didn't matter. The silence grew stronger with each passing day. The Mexican authorities tried to investigate, but every attempt collapsed. Witnesses were too afraid to testify. Police officers who pursued leads often disappeared themselves. Files went missing, and evidence evaporated. Corruption played its role, but even the honest officers found themselves trapped. They couldn't fight what they couldn't see. When international agencies joined the pursuit, they encountered the same dilemma. Unlike loud cartels with trails of blood and destruction, the silent cartel left behind shadows. Their only evidence was absence, and absence was not enough to build a case. Alejandro Vargas himself was rarely seen. He moved in silence, staying in hidden compounds deep in rural Mexico. Some described him as a ghost, always out of reach, always watching. His control was so complete that even without his direct presence, fear of him dictated the lives of thousands. For Alejandro, power was not measured in how many enemies were killed, but in how many people lived in silence because of him. That philosophy made the silent cartel one of the most unique and terrifying organizations in the criminal world. The mark they left behind was psychological more than physical. Entire towns lived like prisoners, ruled not by chains but by fear of the unknown. Even when the black SUVs weren't there, people acted as though they were. Children grew up in silence, learning that speaking too much could cost a life. Businesses functioned in quiet compliance, paying whatever was demanded without negotiation. Alejandro Vargas didn't need to roar to be feared, he only needed to whisper, and often he didn't even need that. The silence spoke for him, and it spoke louder than any gunfire ever could. By the time international authorities realized the cartel's true scale, Alejandro had already expanded his reach beyond Mexico. Smuggling routes, stretched into Central America and even into the United States, but the same methods applied everywhere they went. No noise, no spectacle, just silence and disappearance. Communities fell under their shadow without even realizing it until it was too late. The silent cartel was more than just a criminal group. It was an invisible empire built on the most effective weapon of all, fear that thrived in silence. Bangkok had always been a city of energy, filled with neon lights, bustling markets, and endless movement, but beneath the surface of its lively streets, something darker thrived. It was here that the serpents of the East coiled themselves around the underworld, slowly tightening their grip until escape became impossible. The man at the heart of this empire was the notorious, a former cage fighter whose reputation for brutality had followed him long before he entered the criminal world. The notorious' rise was not accidental. He carried with him a cold philosophy: to strike fast, strike hard, and leave venom behind. That philosophy became the foundation of the Serpents of the East, a gang unlike any other in Southeast Asia. The notorious' life in the fighting pits had shaped him into something ruthless. He understood pain, control, and spectacle, and he transferred those lessons into gang leadership. When he formed the Serpents, he demanded absolute loyalty. Those who joined were forced into rituals that mirrored his days in the cage. Members had to endure beatings, survive brutal endurance trials, and mark themselves with the serpent tattoo, a permanent brand that showed the world they belonged to him. But the notorious was not just about physical domination. He knew fear could be multiplied when it touched every part of a person's life. Victims of the Serpents were often tattooed against their will, marked with the gang's symbol so that every glance in the mirror reminded them of their captor. It was not just violence, it was psychological venom injected into the soul. The Serpents of the East began with underground gambling dens and fight clubs. The notorious used his connections in the fighting world to establish arenas where blood sport was the currency. These places doubled as meeting grounds for smuggling deals and money laundering. As profits grew, the Serpents expanded into narcotics, human trafficking, and smuggling networks that stretched across Thailand's borders. But what made them even more dangerous was their embrace of cybercrime. The notorious recognized the power of technology earlier than most criminals. He recruited skilled hackers, many of them young and disillusioned, and combined their digital talents with his street muscle. The result was a gang that operated in both the physical and virtual worlds with devastating precision. Banks were hacked, accounts drained, and identities stolen, all while drug shipments and weapons trades continued on the ground. Victims never knew whether the next strike would be a violent ambush in an alley or the sudden disappearance of their life savings. The notorious strategy was unpredictability. The Serpents could suffocate a rival with brute force one day and bankrupt him through cyber theft the next. This dual power made them nearly impossible to confront. Police forces could prepare for street violence, but found themselves defenseless against silent digital attacks that crippled infrastructure and stole millions in seconds. The influence of the Serpents spread quickly. Bangkok became their nest, but their coils reached far beyond. Shipping routes in the Gulf of Thailand were exploited for smuggling, and digital footprints of their crimes appeared in places as far away as Singapore and Hong Kong. The notorious men adapted like snakes themselves, shedding old skins whenever authorities closed in. Safe houses were abandoned, operations relocated, and new identities created at a moment's notice. Each time authorities thought they had cornered the gang, they slipped away, leaving only fragments of their existence behind. Life in neighborhoods controlled by the Serpents was suffocating. Locals paid protection money just to exist, and businesses operated under constant threat. Refusal meant destruction. Rivals who dared to challenge the notorious were either forced into drug addiction and then discarded, or they vanished, their bodies sometimes discovered later with snake tattoos carved into their skin. These horrors were designed not just to kill but to terrify anyone else considering resistance. The notorious understood that terror was more powerful when it lingered, like venom that slowly worked its way through the body. By the time the Serpents of the East were recognized internationally, the notorious had already built a reputation as one of the most dangerous figures in organized crime. His control over both the streets and the digital world gave him reach few could match. He was not simply a gangster, he was a strategist who blended primal violence with modern technology. For the people trapped under his rule, the question was never if the Serpents would strike, but when and how. The fear of unpredictability was the venom that kept communities paralyzed. In the heart of Bangkok, beneath the glow of neon lights and the hum of crowded streets, the serpents of the East waited, always ready to coil tighter and strike again. In the cold and fractured corners of Eastern Europe, a gang known as the Crimson Brotherhood carved out a reputation that blurred the line between organized crime and outright terrorism. They were born inside the prison walls of a collapsing system, where brutality was the only form of order and violence the only currency. From those cells, the Brotherhood emerged as more than just a collection of hardened convicts. They became a secret society with rituals, codes, and blood oaths. At the center of it all was Viktor Dragunov, a man whose reputation was built not only on his cruelty but on his uncanny ability to orchestrate chaos with precision. To Viktor, control was not about building peace, but about spreading fear so deeply that society itself bent under the weight of it. The Crimson Brotherhood began small, dominating prison yards and controlling smuggling inside correctional facilities. Cigarettes, drugs and weapons flowed through their hands, and their influence spread across guards and inmates alike. When members were released, they carried the Brotherhood's code back into the outside world, becoming loyal soldiers bound by secrecy. Viktor ensured that every member swore a blood oath, promising loyalty not just to him but to the cause of the Brotherhood. Those who betrayed this oath met gruesome ends, their bodies left in alleys or fields, marked with crimson flags. These flags, drenched in blood, became the gang's calling card, a signal to the world that the Brotherhood had claimed another life. As their numbers grew, so did their ambition. The Brotherhood moved beyond smuggling and began to dominate arms trafficking across Eastern Europe. Viktor understood the value of chaos in unstable regions, selling weapons to militias, rebels, and criminal syndicates. The profits were immense, but for Viktor, the money was only part of the plan. He sought influence. The gang expanded into political assassinations, targeting figures who resisted their growth or threatened to expose their operations. Each assassination was meticulously planned, carried out with such precision that investigators were often left chasing ghosts. Explosions rocked city centers, public figures were gunned down, and yet no clear trail ever pointed back to Viktor. His ability to orchestrate violence while remaining untouchable made him more myth than man. The Brotherhood's internal structure was equally terrifying. It resembled a secret cult more than a traditional gang. Members communicated through coded messages, met in abandoned factories and underground tunnels, and performed rituals meant to strip away individual identity. To be part of the Brotherhood meant losing oneself entirely to the group. Viktor cultivated this atmosphere deliberately, making sure that his men saw him as more than a leader, they saw him as a prophet of power. Under his rule, the Brotherhood was not just a gang, it was an ideology of blood and fear. Communities under their control lived in constant dread. Local businesses were extorted, young men were recruited by force, and families lived with the knowledge that resistance was suicide. The crimson flags served as constant reminders. One day they might flutter on a burned-out storefront, the next, they could be draped over the body of a politician. These symbols were designed to send a message far louder than words. The Brotherhood owned the streets, the prisons, and even the corridors of political power. Governments labeled them terrorists, but labeling did little to weaken them. Viktor's network stretched so deep into underground economies and political systems that rooting them out seemed impossible. Some whispered that the Brotherhood had allies in parliaments and police forces, officials who benefited from the chaos or feared becoming victims themselves. The result was a system where the Brotherhood thrived unchecked, feeding off corruption while amplifying fear. Viktor Dragunov himself remained an enigma. Rarely seen in public, he commanded from the shadows, moving between fortified safe houses and hidden compounds. Yet his influence was everywhere. His name carried the weight of dread, and his presence, even unseen, shaped the actions of entire regions. He believed in ruling through terror not because it was effective, but because it was permanent. Money could be stolen, power could shift, but fear, once planted, lived forever. By the time the Crimson Brotherhood reached the peak of its power, they were no longer just a prison-born gang. They were a network of killers, traffickers, and extremists, bound together by ideology and blood. For Viktor, it was not enough to dominate Eastern Europe. He had set his eyes on a larger stage, building alliances with other dangerous groups across the globe. The crimson flags that once marked isolated crimes now represented something far more alarming: the rise of a global brotherhood built on violence, chaos, and a relentless hunger for power. In the cold streets and dark alleys of Eastern Europe, the Crimson Brotherhood thrived, leaving behind not only blood but the chilling certainty that their venom was spreading far beyond their homeland.